joining from across the world. It's afternoon in the European Union and it's early morning in the United States. And it's a little behind the EU time in UK. So all of us are together, all the panelists are joining in a bit. So I would like to welcome everybody who's registered and actually joined us for the evening today. And I just wanted to highlight that this is an opportunity to have a discussion on the TRIPS waiver during a pandemic. The pandemic has turned out to be one of the defining moments of our generation besides climate change. And we really have an opportunity as governments and civil society and policymakers to define the response to the pandemic, which is taking millions of lives and livelihoods across the world. So, of course, being in New Delhi, I can tell you this, that we were one of the first countries in the developing world to face the Delta surges. And we were losing more than 4,000 people a day. And we have faced not just vaccine shortages, we faced therapeutic shortages. So we are here to hear everyone's views on a very important topic of intellectual property waivers for medical products that are needed extensively across the world. So a very important tool to increase participation and inclusiveness is the Spanish translation. So you can look for the Spanish translation, and I'm going to stop here while Gargia introduces the Spanish translator, Ana.
Ana, you can go ahead.
Buen día. Este webinar cuenta con interpretación simultánea al español. Si desea activarla desde computadoras, busque el icono de interpretación en el menú de herramientas en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Desde tablets y smartphones, busque la opción en el menú, 3 puntos, seleccione su idioma y haga clic en listo para activar la función. En ambos casos tiene la opción de silenciar el audio original si lo prefiere y escuchar solo el audio de la interpretación. Muchas gracias.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna, for being here and allowing people from across the world who understand Spanish to be part of this high-level dialogue. And I'll go as slowly as possible for the translation. A few housekeeping rules. Everyone's sort of muted other than the panelists. So that's just to spare people the trouble of being interrupted while they speak as discussants and panelists. Number 2 is this, of course, everyone's views are welcome, but they have to go through the Q&A channel, not on chat. And, we have many colleagues and experts from civil society right here as part of the panel discussion who will be responding to a number of queries that are being raised in the Q&A. And of course, the panelists themselves are free to respond to some of the Q&As. So I would just like to say this, that everyone's views are welcome because we have a short timeline. We may not be able to take questions, but we will weave some of the questions into the responses and the discussions that we see today. We are also joined by our very first speaker, Sarah Matthew. She's a member of European Parliament, and she belongs to the group of Greens. And I have to thank her to say that, she came in at the last moment to help us address this very important issue. So we have Sarah Matthew, and if she could introduce herself to the audience and the viewers and other panelists, and I'll come straight to the question after her introduction.
Yeah, can you see and hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, it's always a bit of a struggle, these online meetings, and especially when you're using the infrastructure of the European Parliament, because we are not allowed to download Zoom on our computers. So anyway, I will try and make this work as best as can. I'm Sarah Mathieu. I'm a member of the Greens IFA in the European Parliament. And I am one of the ones following the WTO, coming from the INTA committee, so international trade. And this is why, of course, I've been very active on the whole discussion on TRIPS waiver, intellectual property rights. And I was the negotiator for the Greens when we were negotiating the resolution about the TRIPS waiver a couple of months ago. But I get that you had some specific questions vis-a-vis this resolution and the position of the Parliament.
Yes, indeed. So, Sarah, thank you for joining us and giving us that background and knowing that you're following the WTO discussions. It's indeed very heartening. So I'm going to come straight to the point because, all of us are just watching the European Union, day to day, because we are seeing that the European Parliament has been very supportive of the negotiations on the TRIPS waiver. But at the other end, we see the European Commission sort of dragging its feet, slowing it down and blocking it. So we are wondering what's happening and how we can, change this, how we can address those challenges. And if you can highlight some of those issues, it'd be very useful for us. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. It's been a discussion that's been high on our agenda the last couple of months, and rightfully so. I think coming from the Greens and coming from, a part of the Parliament, because it's not so that the entire Parliament, sadly, is convinced of the necessity of this discussion. We've been looking with astonishment towards what the Commission has been doing, because in the beginning it seemed like, we need to vaccinate the world, and the vaccines are a public good, etc. This was really what the Commission was saying. But then it seemed like a turn towards very much Europe-centrated, own vaccinations first, if you will, and we were really disappointed, I have to say, in the fact that the Commission doesn't see that this is actually, a complete lack of solidarity. This is morally wrong, and it's been something that a lot of people have said, but it's still true that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So in that sense, we continue to see the Commission really putting big pharma over people's health. It continues to push its own proposal that is, if I can say it as bluntly as that, baked air. It's not going to change anything when we read what they have proposed on a WTO level. And it's even worse than that, because indeed we've been discussing this for months now. I am in the COVID contact group, which is a group that was formed to inform the Parliament of every step that the Commission is taking when it comes to the vaccines, when it comes to combating the health crisis. So we have a contact with them every week, and every week again I ask them how they can keep on pushing this position not to support the temporary waiver of intellectual property rights. But for now, without really any success. We've had a resolution where indeed we very specifically as a Parliament say that we should start the text-based negotiations on a temporary waiver on the WTO TRIPS agreement. And much to my astonishment, I have to say, we've seen documents coming from diplomats where the Commission is even downplaying this resolution, where they really say, you know what, they didn't really mean it. There's been a couple of MEPs that might have, pressed the wrong button, which is of course complete nonsense, because the resolution was carried with a much larger majority than just one or two missed buttons, if you will. So this is a blatant disrespect of democracy and of the position of the Parliament, if you ask me. But yeah, we do keep the pressure high in this COVID contact group, but also in intercommittee meetings that we have. We think it's very important also to reach out to civil society, to have events like we're having now, to have webinars, etc., to really, make sure that the pressure is still really high. And you see that it's actually working, not so much on the Commission, but on a lot of the other world players, recently we've had Australia also joining the demand for temporary waiver. And well, another way of working, and well, when I speak from my own group, in those majorities, in those member states where we are part of the majority, we also, of course, want a clear communication coming from them, not just to pressure the Commission, but also, yeah, to speak up individually, really, in the build-up towards the WTO conference MC12, to make sure that the Commission changes its mind. And yeah, I think it's also just important to target perhaps specific commissionaries like Kyriakides, to see if she can actually challenge the current common position in the Commission, because we know that it's still very very difficult, it seems, to get them to change their minds and actually see that this is the only way forward.
Thank you, Sarah Matthews, because you know, in the past, as an HIV/AIDS activist, we've seen a lot of resistance even to the Doha Declaration, you know, which was just a mere declaration. And we've also seen resistance at the time when, you know, the free trade agreements were being proposed with a lot of intellectual property barriers. And what we really wanted to say is that what civil society and, you know, people who've been largely affected by COVID and lost loved ones and you know, a lot of people in the pandemic, actually seeking real change and not just another declaration. The declaration is fine, but we need real actions. And I hope that, you know, Sarah, that, you know, with civil society and MEPs, we can continue the dialogue. We've seen that a lot during past endeavors on access to medicines. So one of my last questions is that I wanted to ask you about is, what about Germany? Why is Germany so opposed to the waiver? And how does that influence the European Commission position?
Yeah, I think it's purely economic, to be honest. It's really a question of big lobby. We've seen this when we were negotiating in the European Parliament. For instance, the negotiator of EPP just blatantly said in our negotiations, you know what, BioNTech, that's really my voter district. So that makes it very clear where the pressure is coming from. And so, well, if you know that, well, BioNTech has given a huge boost to German BNP, it's just, I mean, even 0.5% of the German GDP would be biotech alone. That's a huge number. So in that sense, I think it's really the main reason why Germany and in particular Merkel have been very vocal against the waiver, really to protect industry. And to me, well, that's a choice that is unacceptable when there's so many people's lives at stake. But also economically, it doesn't make sense because the longer that this pandemic is going on, the longer we're going to be in a world's economical crisis. So for that, it seems like big lobby in Germany is really strong. And so I'm hoping that, well, German elections are, of course, very, very rapidly approaching, that perhaps a new majority with Greens could maybe change the position of the German leadership. That would be a good thing, I think, when we're trying to build up this pressure against the Commission. But I think it's as simple as that. It's lobby, it's economical interest.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us on a short notice, literally a couple of hours ago, to also help your colleague Anna Cavazzini. And we hope to continue the dialogue as civil society with the group of Greens. It was a pleasure having you, and please feel free to stay on longer on the panel discussion. And
thanks
you have
a lot.
access. Yeah, thank you. You have access to the Q&A, so if you want to take a look at some of the responses, feel free to do that. So I'm going to go to the second speaker. I see that Congressman Khanna has joined us, and I'm going to pin him to the screen. Yes, thank you so much. So welcome, Congressman. I'm the moderator of the session, Leena Menghaney. We are discussing the TRIPS waiver, and if you could introduce yourself, and I'll then ask you the question that we've been waiting to ask you for a very long time.
Thank you. Thank you, Leena, for your leadership, and thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to Lori Wallach, who has just been relentless at Public Citizen in organizing members of Congress on this very, very important issue. This issue is so fundamental. If you believe that every human life has dignity and has moral worth, then we need to ensure that everyone has access to this vaccine. And a first step to getting people access to the vaccine is making sure that we're sharing the know-how of how they can build it. This is critically important, especially because government in the United States has been instrumental in the development of these vaccines. We are the ones with the NIH who have funded some of the critical research. We have provided purchase agreements that mitigated the risk for a lot of these pharmaceuticals. They would not have done what they did if it weren't for those government guarantees. And so it was appropriate for the government to do this, but that shows that these vaccines have a public purpose. And the science is undisputed, and the public opinion now is recognizing this, that a variant developing anywhere, that unvaccinated people anywhere threaten those who are vaccinated. Of course, we've seen this most dramatically, how the unvaccinated threaten the vaccinated within the United States, but the same logic applies globally. We don't live with large forts around countries anymore. And if there is a variant somewhere else, eventually that can come to the United States and wreak a great havoc. So there is a practical necessity for having the TRIPS waiver, which would basically say that you get paid for licensing, sharing your technology. It's not asking for it for free, but it's saying that you have an obligation to sell it to a third party for a fair price. And there is, of course, the moral obligation. So why is it delayed? I mean, the president, of course, is for this, and our trade representative has done a strong job. I think people need to follow the lead of, in this case, the United States, and get on board with the TRIPS waiver. And then we can also have global manufacturing funds for global manufacturing production. It's not an either or. People say, well, we need more manufacturing capacity. Well, that's true, but actually the TRIPS waiver would incentivize more funding into manufacturing. And I don't know if you have Nobel Laureate Stiglitz coming. I don't want to talk about the economics. He can provide all the economic justification much better than I can. But it seems to me very common sense that if you have a TRIPS waiver and people know that they can use the technology, that's going to lead to more capital inflow into setting up manufacturing for that. So we need to do both. We need to have the TRIPS waiver, and we need to have greater investment in global manufacturing. The Congress will continue to advocate forcefully to have this president's back and to make sure that he is making this a high priority in our bilaterals with Germany and other European countries to make sure we get the TRIPS waiver done.
Yeah, so thank you so much, actually, because that's the background for the questions as well. My first question to you is that the US did an absolutely groundbreaking announcement in May that they would be supporting the waiver. And in some sense, it was the green lighting of the start of the negotiations. But since then, other member states have slowed down the negotiations. So what can we do together to speed this up? One. And number two, I just wanted to ask, having, lived in India during those, I think, 6 weeks of absolutely, as I call them, black days and black nights, where we had people dying on a daily basis. And one of the things we saw was shortages of therapeutics, including some very high-priced monopoly therapeutics like tocilizumab from Roche. And so I'm asking both the questions: can we not have the waiver for not just for vaccine, but for life-saving medicines as well? And number two is, what can we do to speed up this process? I can tell you now, as Medicines Sans Frontières, we can't even get 6,000 vials of tocilizumab from Roche, let alone what we will need in the future and the needs in across the developing world. So on these issues, if you could respond, that'd be really great.
Well, Leena, I appreciate you raising that. I mean, the Delta variant, of course, was awful, and there are 4 Indian Americans in Congress. We were very, very vocal at the time that the United States needed to do all we could to assist India, and the president did mobilize a number of resources. But it's an important lesson, because back then we thought, oh, this is happening halfway across the world. How does it affect us? And of course, the Delta variant that was in India eventually now has taken over the entire United States, which again highlights the interconnectedness of pandemics and the self-interest that the United States has to have a waiver and allocate billions of dollars to helping global manufacturing. By the way, Congress has allocated some of this. It has to actually be administered. And the president, in my view, has shown strong leadership on the TRIPS waiver. And he has to convince our European friends or European allies who are often fond of lecturing the United States about moral responsibility to live up to theirs. And this is a clear case of the moral and right thing to do and the economically smart thing to do. And I think it has to extend to therapeutics. And more broadly, we need to have a better system in this world for how we incentivize the production and distribution of drugs to the poor, and for issues of that really affect large numbers of population. I mean, a purely for-profit model of developing medicines leads to, in my view, an overinvestment in acne treatment and an underinvestment of treatment of some of the biggest diseases. And again, I know we have the economist Nobel Laureate Stiglitz on, and he'll, I'm sure, talk more about that. But not only do we need a TRIPS waiver in this case, but we need to think about how can we incentivize the development and the production of medicine that actually are affecting the urgent needs of many people in the United States and around the world.
Much, Congressman, and I just wanted to say that this is the perfect moment for me to welcome Professor Joseph Stiglitz. He's the Nobel Laureate, the economist from the University of Columbia. And I just wanted to ask him a few questions. And if you don't mind, I will unpin you, Mr. Khanna, and
Sure,
unpin Professor. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. I'm Leena. I'm the moderator. I'm based in New Delhi, and we've just started the discussion on the waiver. And I just had this, burning question, and I just read your op-ed about how actions of persons impact the well-being of others in a pandemic. And in some sense, when I read the op-ed, impacted other countries' well-being. And I just wanted to straight out come and ask you, is that on the negotiations on the TRIPS waiver, which is actually a temporary waiver of intellectual property, we've seen Germany slow the whole process down of negotiations. And what do you think about the European Commission's ethical responsibility about taking this forward?
Well, obviously, I think it's very objectionable. Let me say that I also think that there's a lot of confusion on a number of grounds. First, this is not the abolition of property rights. They still get compensated for using their intellectual property rights. So it's not taking away their property rights. It's just saying we are in an emergency, and in this emergency, that intellectual property rights have to be available more widely. Secondly, it's not even a change in the intellectual framework, because since the beginning of the WTO, we've recognized the principle of compulsory licenses. This is effectively just a compulsory license. It's the only difference between the standard compulsory license and the waiver is to lower transaction costs. Lowering transaction costs in the midst of the pandemic, where there's a kind of urgency that we don't normally have, is absolutely essential. So it is a response to the exigencies of the moment and the long history of the drug companies who have dragged their feet for obvious reasons. Their concern is maximizing profits. That's their business model. And maximizing profits means restricting supply, because by restricting supply, you increase price. And by increasing price, you increase profits. The head of Pfizer talked about planning to sell his vaccine for $175 a dose after the immediate waves get resolved. What he is saying, in effect, is that he believes that there's going to be a shortage, that with all the various vaccines on the market, he's going to be able to extract a monopoly price. So let's be clear, what the vaccine debate waiver is about is the ability of the drug companies to exercise that monopoly power to get not just a reasonable return on their investment. Most of the investment, by the way, has been publicly provided, not privately provided. The government provided all of the basic research, and much of the money that went to bring the basic research to the market. So they're getting amply compensated for their investments. What they want, obviously, is monopoly returns. Now, Germany's particular view on this is especially peculiar because biotech already sold its international rights to Pfizer. So the waiver is not even going to affect the profits that biotech gets, because the countries that are affected are countries where it is Pfizer whose profits will be affected. And they're already doing very, very well. So to me, what is going on is unconscionable. It also, we have to admit that we are in the midst of what some people call the new Cold War. On the one hand, there are authoritarian governments like Russia, China, and on the other hand, there are democracies. And we would like the democracies to win. And we're not putting a good face on democracy when we say our democracies put profits over lives. Russia has been very actively engaged in vaccine diplomacy. It's made its vaccine available, say, in a country like Argentina. Not only has it made its vaccine available, it's actually actively engaged in transferring technology and enabling countries to build plants to produce the vaccine. And I'm afraid we're losing this particular battle.
So coming to the point that you've just raised, so there is business as usual, where pharma is being backed by some powerful governments. We see Roche and Switzerland, we see BioNTech, Pfizer, and Germany, but also this narrative of nationalism, that this is our research, and in some sense, TRIPS waiver is sort of taking it all away. So how would you respond to this, the wrong side of history, as I would say, that countries have decided to sort of pick? How would you respond to that?
So first, I would say, but this is not a change in the intellectual property framework. We've had compulsory licenses. The world has debated this. It debated it when the WTO TRIPS got initially adopted. It re-debated that in the context of HIV/AIDS and reaffirmed the principle of compulsory licenses. So this is not a change in the framework, and it's only a change in an attempt to lower the transaction cost in response to the exigencies, the urgency of the moment. But the second point I would say is the most important aspect in many ways of globalization is a globalization of knowledge. And it was the international community working together that produced the vaccines. It was, for instance, governments around the world that provided the money that discovered DNA. It was particularly money in the United States, University of Pennsylvania, that discovered the basics of mRNA vaccines, Hungarian working in America. It was a Turk working in Germany with support from the German government that helped develop the biotech version of the vaccine. But in the United States, Moderna, several of the critical patents are held by the US government, and it's not charging for those patents. So this has been an international effort of people from all over the world. The scientists have really cooperated on this. And that's the nature of what good science is really about. Knowledge is the fundamental public good, and addressing the problem of pandemics, public health, is also a fundamental public good.
So coming to this issue of, how science progresses collectively and, the role of the World Trade Organization, and particularly two epidemics or pandemics, as I would call it, we saw that, I was a student in 2000, a law student, and we saw the WTO drag its feet towards even a declaration recognizing that, governments could use TRIPS flexibilities. And, here we are 20 years later, we see the WTO not doing anything in particular, to speed in the process of the negotiations. So where does the WTO stand in these issues, and what would you say to the WTO about these issues? Because what we've seen, it's exactly almost a year since the proposal was tabled, and interestingly, it was tabled on Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, who was a great believer in, sharing science. And I just wanted to say that where does the WTO stand in all of this? It doesn't seem to be moving things along. What would you tell the WTO DG? Yeah.
Let me say first that if we had acted last October, I believe that the supply of vaccines would have been substantially greater today. There's strong evidence of that. The major problem we face today is the lack of supply. With that shortage, one person gets it, another person doesn't. We need to ramp up the production. I believe markets are able to do that. But if markets can't, the United States government needs to use the Defense Supply Act to increase the production. But anybody who says that the market can't produce syringes or glass vials or the ingredients that make up a vaccine is really expressing a lack of confidence in the market. And so there's an irony about people who say they believe in markets, but then saying, oh, there are these fundamental bottlenecks. They really are saying they don't believe in markets. To go back to your first question, many people in Germany say, and in Europe say, the fundamental problem is the ability of developing countries or other countries to produce the vaccine. If they really believe that, then let there be access to intellectual property rights, and there will be no consequences, and then we'll see the bottleneck is somewhere else, and then we'll be able to address that bottleneck. But they are intellectually incoherent in saying there'll be disastrous consequences of the waiver, and at the same time saying the waiver won't do any good. You can't have it both ways, and they have a kind of intellectual incoherence that I find deeply troubling. Now, on the question of the WTO, remember, international organizations are nothing but the international community coming together or not coming together. So the problem is that the framework for the WTO was originally set to require a broad consensus, in some cases, unanimity of all the countries, or almost unanimity. So the problem is not so much the WTO, it's Germany, it's those other countries, especially in Europe, that are dragging their feet. And the result of that is that not only are people dying as they drag their feet, but we have to remember the longer the disease festers, the higher the probability that there will be a mutation, which is more deadly, more contagious, or more vaccine resistant. It is not in our self-interest that we allow this disease to fester. So what makes me so angry is this is a kind of example of short-sighted selfishness, that it is not in the interest of Europe, it's not in the interest of Germany, it's not in the interest of the United States that so many people not have access to the vaccine. This is an emergency, and let's not fight over what is the critical bottleneck. Let's do everything as quickly as we can to make sure that every possible bottleneck is simultaneously being addressed. And there's no doubt that intellectual property is one of the bottlenecks that has to be removed. And it's the one thing that the market can't do. The market can solve other problems, but it can't solve this problem.
Yes, thank you, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. That brings me perfectly to the next speaker, that is Dr. Siva, and I would like to introduce her. So I'm going to unpin you, and if you look at the Q&A, I'm sure there are several questions addressed to you. So if you could also respond to a couple, that would be great. I'm going to ask Dr. Siva to, I'm going to try and, great. Yeah. Hi, Dr. Siva. It's welcome to the high-level dialogue. And we met before, and on the TRIPS issue, it's been a long, contentious road. 18 months into the pandemic, a year into the TRIPS waiver. So I'm going to get really to the point. You're from the London School of Economics and Political Science. You are an IP expert. You teach the area, and you actually particularly have no conflict of interest. I just wanted to say this, that one of the first things we tend to hear is, from big pharma, that IP is a non-issue. In contrast, we see over 150 academics and experts get together and write a letter highlighting why the TRIPS waiver needs to be supported. So what is this TRIPS waiver all about in law? And what is it going to trigger is my question. So I'm going to get right to the point with you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Leena. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and also the wonderful panel you've arranged. So there have been many voices, not just from pharma, that say the call for the TRIPS waiver comes from people who do not understand IP, who do not understand how patents work, and is not grounded in the operational elements of how intellectual property actually works to make vaccines and drugs, for instance, available. So it's in this context that those of us, professors, academics, researchers who work in this area, not just from a historic or theoretical perspective, but also from an operational angle, felt it was absolutely necessary that we present the case. We analyze what the legal case for the TRIPS waiver is and present it, for scrutiny. And we conclude that the TRIPS waiver is a necessary and proportionate response to the global pandemic. So I have to emphasize here that the letter is quite a collaborative effort, and it's a multi-institutional initiative, including Professor Dutfield, who's here, who's my colleague. And I would urge those who are listening to revisit not just the letter, but also the long form paper we put out establishing the need for the TRIPS waiver. Now, the shortages we are seeing is a result of carefully curated supply. And this form of, what Professor Stiglitz referred to as bottlenecking is an inherent part of the business model. It's these shortages and the scarcities that facilitate the kind of returns from the marketplace that the pharmaceutical industry has come to expect. Now, if you look at IP scholarship, there's a very fraught relationship between intellectual property, global health, and capital. So our letter and the legal case we make for the waiver is situated in this historic and institutional context. So perhaps, Leena, just going to the second part of your question, I could go into first principles about what the waiver actually is. And I think even in the conversation I've heard so far, there seems to be some confusion about what we're talking about. So from my point of view, the waiver at the WTO will allow individual countries to suspend the rules that they may have made under the TRIPS agreement. So it will allow individual countries to make that call, whether they want to suspend these rules. And they may decide not to. So it is by no means a wholesale stripping away of property rights. It will still require positive action from state governments to put that into place. In terms of the scope of the waiver and what it represents, we've always argued that it should extend across all intellectual property, and it should not be restricted to vaccines. Why all of intellectual property? It's not just patents that are a problem. The technology that we need to manufacture, not just the vaccines, but also, let's say, drugs and other therapeutics that we might need in the future or now, are controlled through a broad range of intellectual property rights, including trade secrets, informal know-how, even copyright. So for instance, computational methods that we need to design mRNA, for instance, may be wrapped up under copyright. We know that exclusive data that's submitted to regulatory authorities contain a lot of information that's necessary for manufacturing, for instance. So it's really important that the waiver is across the board and is not restricted to patents. I think that would be very, very reductive. And also that it extends not just to vaccines. The vaccines are, of course, the immediate need, but we are going to be dealing with COVID-19 for a long time to come. A couple of days ago, Professor Andrew Pollard said, the world is on fire. Health systems across the world are under intense pressure, right? So it's not just about the vaccines are one part of that story. Now, a broad waiver will allow what we call workarounds. So if you have a waiver where intellectual property is not an issue, we might expect improvements, cheaper versions of the technology, workarounds to happen in a way that's not chilled or controlled by the IP holder. That is also a kind of spillover effect that we should expect to come from the waiver. So let me just go very, very centrally to this argument that IP is not implicated in vaccine shortages, right? So if IP is not implicated, the argument goes the waiver will not have any consequences. It will not have any impact in increasing vaccine production. And as Professor Stiglitz has already mentioned this, the fact that there are other problems, supply chain problems, for instance, does not diminish, in our view, the centrality of IP as IP monopolies creating a sort of scarcity. Now, if those who support the waiver, it's incumbent on us to also lay out what would happen if the waiver came into effect, right? The waiver is not a silver bullet. It's not going to magically create extra doses of that vaccine. It's going to need positive, affirmative action from governments that are now freed up to do what they can under their own laws to positively encourage technology transfer. And that's not going to come through simple compulsory licenses. Compulsory licenses can only be directed to patents. And all the information you need to manufacture may not be, and in fact, I think it's right to say will not be encapsulated just in the patent. So given this positive action is required, I would like to refer to it as a waiver regime. We need to see a whole range of plural measures that will come into place under the waiver. So one way in which I can make this case is to say, let's now consider how in the last, let's say 6 months or so, we've actually scaled up production in wealthier countries, right? What have we seen? We've seen advance orders for IP, to IP holders, which is a way of providing funding, right? We've seen repurposing of existing or unused manufacturing capacity, very important. Moderna did not own a vaccine manufacturing capacity in the beginning of 2020, but it's a leading manufacturer. BioLice, we've seen a lot of reports on how it's gone from producing oncology drugs to now being able to produce biosimilars, such that it's actually in a position to seek a license from Johnson & Johnson. We've seen rapid licensing and manufacturing under contractual agreements with the IP holders. We have seen, so for instance, even yesterday, I think Moderna announced a new arrangement with National Resilience, which is a new sort of means of increasing production. And we've seen sort of supply chains resolve through the management of export and import control orders. Again, something that is controlled by the IP holder. Now, all of these things that I have listed happens at the behest of the IP holder. Now, the fact that this has not been replicated the world over or is being done in dribs and drabs means that the whole process is controlled and curated by IP holders, right? So in this context, what the waiver will allow us to do, and I'm going to submit that it's going to allow us to form a sort of private ordering, right, to emerge. So once companies are assured that there's freedom to operate because of the waiver, then we expect different kinds of arrangements, new entities, new companies, entities that are nimble, that can produce improve technology, produce endogenous technology, make it more cost effective. We expect all of these entities to then have the possibility of entering into the fray. And this private ordering, I think, is really important because in a situation where you have countries that are, let's say, cash or governance poor, some sort of private ordering that is directed by public-minded goals can really fill that gap. And that waiver regime is not simply about just one compulsory license and one patent. It's a whole host of things that needs to happen. And this is why we have said in our research that the waiver is a legal and political tool, and it's a sort of masthead from which a range of different actions need to flow. There's also a longer term perspective, I think, that is very, very important. Copying or imitating technology is not a passive process. It's an extremely productive form of learning. So if we allow immediate measures to improve innovative capacity in, let's say, middle-income countries, we are inevitably building technological resilience for the future. And this is a really important part of what I think we're all seeking from the waiver coming into place. So perhaps I'll leave it there, Leena. So I think it's really important that we agree on what the waiver encloses.
Yeah. So before I come to my second question, I just wanted to ask you this question, that it seems that, companies and countries, particularly wealthy ones, you in some ways dominated, and profited from the intellectual property system, want to continue to control all aspects of the system and are much more comfortable in the contract manufacturing. Even India sort of falls into, that comfortable zone of contract manufacturing, and not sort of allow LMICs to move forward. And I just wanted to sort of ask you, what do you think? In some sense, this seems to be a very colonial structure of, we'll give the donations, we'll give the charity, but when it comes to intellectual property, the rules cannot be changed. And then, of course, it's a matter of record that, many countries like India and South Africa actually inherited the intellectual property systems, not because they wrote it themselves into law, but because they inherited it as part of the colonial system. So what do you think about their model of contract manufacturing? And, we are doing this voluntarily, what, people call the third way in some sense, or the WTO calls the third way. Yeah.
So I think that's a really good question, and I'm sure it's a question that's on the minds of a lot of your listeners at the moment. The fact of the matter is, we could solve this problem through voluntary licensing. We could, if it had happened at scale and if it had been rolled out with urgency, even the contract manufacturing would have sufficed. Now, the fact of the matter is that that hasn't happened to the scale that we absolutely require. What is it? 2% of low-income countries are vaccinated. It's a catastrophic outcome. 1 year plus into having the vaccines and making them available in wealthier countries. So the contract model is just that. It's a contract. It's not. I do not see that as sharing of technology. And I think it really needs, this should really give us pause for thought, because when we talk about technology transfer, we tend to talk about, and clearly we seem to be talking only about technology that is not valuable. If it is valuable, it is protected by IP. So when you talk about technology transfer, you're talking about all the dregs that are not protected by IP that can be transferred, because most of the valuable IP continues to be protected to contracts. So the contract manufacturing, like Professor Stiglitz says, we need everything. We need all hands on deck. So if we can get voluntary licenses, I would say, yeah, we should do that. We should be encouraging these companies. And how do we encourage them? This is where the positive measures come in. Put in clauses when you give your universities money that say you have to oblige them to engage in meaningful technology transfer, for instance. There are, academics Olga Gurkula and John Hull have put forward a proposal for a compulsory license on trade secrets. Jamie Love has said we should be buying out trade secrets. So there are any number of measures that we need to start investigating and exploring for technology transfer. Contract manufacturing is not technology transfer, but contract manufacturing can increase vaccine production.
Yeah. So I'm going to come directly to the second question, and anybody of the panelists later on, maybe we can respond to the whole model of contract manufacturing versus, more independent manufacturing. And I just wanted to come back to you and say that I've lived in India and I've worked on intellectual property barriers for the last 18 years. And it's been year on of grind to, talk to the government about compulsory license, because we're just not talking as people and citizens or civil society. We've got this shadow over us, which is the USTR, the 301 report, the European Commission, and so on. So compulsory licensing, the European Union Commission says is the proposal that they've put forward. And they say that just, it requires clarification, some tweaks to the system. And it's interesting that after opposing it for decades and actually discouraging it, it now chooses to turn around and talk about compulsory licensing, when it itself has not been able to issue compulsory licenses very successfully. So what do you think about the EU's proposal? Is it really a good concrete proposal that, sort of as concrete as what's been put forward by 64 countries at the moment, supported by 100 countries? Or is it something to just predominantly block the TRIPS waiver? What's your opinion on that? As an IP expert, do you think there's something substantial in that proposal that we should actually be reading it and thinking about it twice? Yeah.
So this is really interesting. And I think, a lot of people in my position would like to see text-based proposals come forward so that we can actually talk about the substance of what is being proposed. Now, I would say that even those who oppose the TRIPS waiver, it's incumbent upon them to come up with solutions to increase vaccine production at scale and urgently. The EU document, I believe, I think it's quite performative. It's performative because in large part, it states the obvious, right? So the compulsory license mechanism does exist. It says a pandemic can be a national emergency, which is bleeding obvious, I think. It also says you can notify multiple products and processes at one go, which also can be done at the moment. It says authorization for a compulsory license may be waived. Maybe you can have a compulsory license without taking the permission of the patent holder. Now, again, this is something that some countries, EU member states and outside, have already done once the pandemic has started. They've tweaked their own laws to say that they can either cut short the process of seeking permission or otherwise do that with executive action. Now, what this tells us is that apart from stating the obvious that in a pandemic, you cannot enter into detailed negotiations with the patent holder, what has happened with respect to these other countries changing their laws is that negotiating with the pharma industry is very difficult. It is a process that is subject to predatory delay, and there's asymmetric information. The seeker of the compulsory license is never going to have perfect information about what they need to be able to manufacture. It's also very reductive, I think, as a proposal, because it equates the whole logic of the waiver to compulsory licenses on patents, which is the most narrow form of the waiver that you can adopt. Now, under TRIPS, a compulsory license can only apply to a patent. Now, the most important thing, so I would also say that their proposal is selective because it ignores the most important thing, even in its own reductive framework, which is timing. Now, you can only take a compulsory license once a patent is granted. It can take up to 4 years for a patent to be granted, up to 18 months for a patent to be published. So at the moment, it's very possible that patents have not been applied for in a lot of these lower and middle income countries, because you only tend to take a patent if there is a danger of being copied in that market. If you feel that the technology is too complex, you might be better off simply not taking a patent or just simply not entering the market, but just selling to them as a consumer. So timing and patents is something that is quite insurmountable in a situation of emergency. I think it's also selective in the sense that it ignores the very real problems we have with compulsory licenses under the Doha arrangement. Now, this is well documented. There are scholars who've been writing about this for decades. It's on paper, it's a good solution, but in reality, it has worked out very poorly. We have an example in real time with the agreement between Bolivia and BioLice. BioLice is willing to supply doses, J&J doses to Bolivia, but is unable to do so because Canada simply hasn't put in place what it needs to do, the notification that it needs to put in place to allow that to happen. BioLice has had approached J&J for a voluntary license, which had been denied. And those who are following the story and those who are working with Bolivia and BioLice on this say, it is so cumbersome, it's so burdensome. And I think there was a quote in one of the narratives on this saying, it's like triggering the fire alarm, reaching for the hose, but then realizing that it's not connected to water. So you have no way of actually actualizing this arrangement. So I would say in this context that a compulsory license is a sort of higher order, I say higher order not because it's effective, but a sort of abstract on the paper solution that works well if you have a semi-functioning international patent system that meets public health needs. That's not the case here. The problem is manufacturing capacity. If we do not increase manufacturing capacity, no country is going to take a compulsory license to export vaccines when there isn't enough capacity to meet their own domestic needs. So the problems are very real. And also remember that even with the compulsory license, even with the waiver, for instance, countries can decide not to participate, not to be part of the solution. But that's a different kind of moral problem.
Yeah, and I feel that in some sense, this is a battle that should be left to civil society and to hold the governments accountable for. That you have this, we had the Doha declarations, we've been holding our governments accountable for TRIPS flexibilities that have been sort of articulated in the Doha declaration. It's our job, people who live in those countries, to ask the governments to do as much as they can for to simply say that, it's not going to work is just not enough. So on that note, if you don't mind, I unpin you and ask Graham to join us. Thank you so much, Dr. Siva. It was lovely to have you here. Yeah.
Thank you, Leena.
So we have Professor Graham Dutfield. I actually happened to read his articles when we were in the throes of the Novartis campaign to asking them to drop the case on an imaginative patent, and he wrote a very interesting piece during the court case. And I'm not going to go into the details, but it was quite pivotal at that time. Professor Graham Dutfield is from the University of Leeds, and he brings together the areas of intellectual property and governance, which I think we need increasing parts of it in the pandemic. So I'm going to come right to it, Professor Dutfield, or if I may call you Graham, is what do you think should be the responsibility of governments, concerning the whole package, tech transfer, intellectual property, and what have governments really done about this? I mean, there's a lot of double speak that's going on, and we are at a point where, that's what I call, we're watching people die. And once again, as people of color, we just can't believe that this whole system is being slowed down by the European Commission. So I just wanted to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Leena. Well, for those of my age who do retain some idealism, the last 18 months or so have been incredibly disappointing. So on the one hand, we see a massive burden being placed on global citizens. So the global citizens are bearing the burdens of deaths of loved ones, of injured people, of devastating economies, effects on employment, healthcare, school education, etc., etc. So we have this massive burden. Obviously, my burden is a lot smaller than billions of other people, but it's still very much there. We feel it as well. Higher taxes, etc., etc. So we all have to sort of pay for this. And yet, on the one hand, we have this situation. On the other, we have shareholder capitalism, hyper shareholder capitalism, which has nothing to do with social conscience whatsoever. I mean, just look at Pfizer. Do I need to add much to Pfizer? It's really horrific. Utterly horrific. Every time Mr. Borla opens his mouth, I squirm. I find everything he says is deeply offensive from my personality, which I just can't help but do. So, I'm also a bit of a historian of the pharmaceutical industry. And I ask the question, well, and of course, historians will always say, be careful about using, past examples, past case studies. But if we look briefly at the example of, say, penicillin, the early 1940s, at that time, so that's quite relevant, I think, in certain respects. This is not, a story about a new product. It was a story about, an existing product, but it could not be mass produced. So the necessary sort of rapid scale up in manufacturing was an urgent situation because of the Second World War. So the US government, we need to supply vast amounts of penicillin to people who need it. How do we do this? Well, what they did was government brought together industry and universities, and they pooled their knowledge, they shared their know-how, they pooled their knowledge. And ironically, it's out of that situation that Pfizer turned into a major corporation. It was because of penicillin that Pfizer became a major corporation through the sharing of know-how. That's one of those historical facts Pfizer perhaps wouldn't like me to mention very much. So what happens in the 1980s is that shareholder capitalism becomes hyper shareholder capitalism, and we have the Chicago School, etc. It says that managers have one obligation and one obligation only, and that is to maximize shareholder value. That's their job. That's all they have to do. Social responsibility, human rights, nope, that's nothing to do with it. Right. So the 1980s is where this sort of ethos, it comes very much to the fore. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry loves this. not surprisingly, and they really embrace this big time. And of course, people suffer, right, as we're seeing now. So in the 1980s, so we have this at the same time, we also have this new sort of view that the more IP you have, the more innovation you have. And of course, we have the beginnings of trade-related IP, which industry lobbies for and helps to actually design, right? And one of the things that particularly sort of upsets me in a way is that this word innovation has been co-opted. And so innovation apparently just means the same as inventing. Inventing is innovation, therefore, the more patents you have, the more innovation you have. This is absolute nonsense, because if you go back to early economists, like Schumpeter and others, supply and distribution is an essential to innovation. It's not what you do in the lab, it's what you do with it afterwards. And vaccines that only some people in the world can access, that's not innovation, really. That doesn't impress me much. I want to see innovation go around the world so that all those who need it will get it. Okay, so for all this, the high income countries where these firms are domiciled will do no more than suggest voluntary licensing. Voluntary licensing would be a very, very good thing, and I would agree if that voluntarism was actually there, but we're not seeing that much of it. I mean, AstraZeneca is going some way. Pfizer is really not helpful at all. And okay, so like Pontius Pilate, the advanced governments, economic governments are basically saying, well, we don't own the rights, therefore it's up to industry. Of course, actually universities do have quite a lot of the rights, but they still say it's not for us. And of course, technology is, in a sense, the sort of big lie of the last 50 years. I mean, I can make a list probably of all the treaties, the international agreements, from the Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Change Convention, the WHO pandemic preparedness, that instrument as well. They all talk about technology transfer, and then they say, well, it's not for us to do it because TRIPS creates the climate, which will encourage technology transfer. And just let it happen, and it will just happen by itself. Well, no, it doesn't happen by itself. So the consequences of all this I think, are tragic and really quite shameful. So the situation we now have is that. I'll get to your question, right, and answer it. But I hope you find this a useful little roundabout journey with me.
No
So
problem.
please bear with me for a little bit. Okay, so what's happening is, of course, COVID is being left to run wild, and new variants are being produced. Now, the fact that there are new variants evolving is clearly, a very bad thing. It is a terrible thing for all of us, for the global public. But is it terrible for industry? Clearly, it's not for Pfizer, because Pfizer can make even more money out of this. Pfizer can make money out of booster shots to be sold in the rich world. And of course, they can go and tweak the vaccines, in a sense, create new products, which makes the earlier products obsolete. So we move on to new products. So this is year on year massive profits for Pfizer. So private gain is not just, not gains for the global public. It is global public loss. What do we do about this? So, what is good for Pfizer is not good for the world, but it is actually dangerous. And so, what do we do about this? Try as I might through writing articles and books which not many people read. Clearly, this adherence to shareholder capitalism, which goes back to particularly the 1980s, Reagan and Thatcher. This needs to be countered, needs to be opposed. We need to really change this. But we need to change this in my part of the world, in the rich world. We need to completely change this. I don't quite know how we actually do this. So that's something we need to have a conversation about. How do we convince governments, policymakers, that shareholder maximization as the ethos of industry is actually dangerous? It is lethal. And it is lethal in a pandemic. And we really need to act on this. It's lethal in a pandemic. We cannot afford it anymore. It needs to be opposed. It needs to be stopped. So as for the waiver, and government, of course, they should support it. Yes, of course they should. But we forget actually how modest is the waiver proposal. Before 1995, it wouldn't have even been, we wouldn't have even needed to discuss it. We wouldn't have even needed to discuss it. And actually, it's something that individually countries can do. It's legal under TRIPS. Just look at Article 73 on the security exemption. And of course, in a sense, while I wouldn't normally praise ex-President Donald Trump, but when he invoked the security exception, of course, the Article 73 of TRIPS is mirrored in, I think, Article 21 of GATT, exactly the same words. He invoked Article 21 of GATT in order to impose tariffs on certain metals that were imported from Europe, the EU, and from China. So in a sense, he didn't just show that invoking security exception can be done. In a sense, he drove a tank through it and said, yes, we just do it and that's it. Now, of course, it is justiciable. It is because WTO cases have shown this. But the fact is, it is there. It is there. It's in Article 73 of TRIPS. It can actually be used. Okay, I think I'll finish there. But if you have a follow-up question, Leena.
I do actually. So, and also to the other panelists, if they want to join us and to Third World Network and Public Citizen, now that, we are having a more open discussion. I just wanted to sort of highlight that, last week 10 days ago, we saw African civil society and African governments express their outrage that doses actually produced in Africa were being sent to Europe, the J&J single-dose vaccines. We then saw a reversal of that decision from J&J and the European Union. They decided that they would not be taking those doses and in fact would return them. But a similar story is now playing out in India. Millions of doses are parked in the biological e-manufacturing side, waiting to be shipped to Europe all over again. And it's the same model, it's the same pharmaceutical model. India is brilliant at inventive and innovative capacity, but continues to be used just a kind of contract manufacturing base. So in some sense, the outrage that African civil society have expressed, we are seeing the same outrage in Indian civil society about these issues. And in some sense, when you talked about technology transfer, I think when IFPMA, when they say that we're going to have enough doses available by the end of this year, what they're talking about is a model that, frankly, sort of suits the developed world to get doses for themselves first and then to hand over the donations to the rest of the world. So I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on all of this that's happening in Africa and India, which have started to be, express that they want to make these vaccines and medicines and are gearing up to look at policies towards that. And where do we go from that? India has turned into more of a contractual model than actually fully independent generic, medicine or vaccine producer, as we saw during the AIDS epidemic. And we are seeing actually doses made in countries like India and Africa being shipped out to the European Union to be then decided where they should be available. So what is your thought process on this whole process, and maybe Siva also, that in some sense they accuse us of lack of capacity, and another level we are contract manufacturers. So where do we go from here? Yeah.
Well, I do think the way is regional hubs, because every pandemic is not just a tragedy; it's also a warning. And I mean, the rather pathetic way that we have coped with COVID-19. I mean, it's incredible. Utterly lame and pathetic. We countries acting with extreme selfishness. I mean, I do understand that governments feel they need to satisfy the demands of their own citizens, but this is completely extreme, and diverting vaccines away from the poor world back to the rich world. I just find it absolutely absolute insanity. I'm staggered by it. Yeah, I mean, the idea of how regional hub is much talked about. We do need to do it, So maybe I'll pass it on to Siva, who might give a more, perhaps a more detailed response.
So Siva, the last word is to you before I thank the organizers. Yeah. I think you have to unmute yourself.
I'm just saying that I always find Graham's moral outrage very productive. So, that was great. So just picking up on that, as I said, I don't think contract manufacturing is technology transfer. But look, there is enough for everybody, right? We know how to do this. We know how to produce these vaccines. We need to just produce sufficient quantities. Now, it can happen immediately through contract production, but let's not kid ourselves about what exactly that is. It is very constricted. It is, you're not going to have any ability to improve or work with that technology. You probably have very tightly controlled employment contracts in place to make sure there's no leakage. This is not technology transfer. But if we can see enough vaccines produced through that mechanism, frankly, I would settle for it while we continue to work on the waiver. But the truth of the matter is we've not had enough of those arrangements at scale. And therefore, any shortages, there's no other way to see this, any shortages is curated by IP holders. And people are dying as a result. It's not dramatic. It's not untrue. Every day that goes by that we can't get these doses into these countries, people are dying because they're not vaccinated. I think there's a larger question here, Leena, perhaps to sort of end the question here. There was a grand bargain in the TRIPS agreement. And the grand bargain was that poorer countries will eventually become technologically proficient and be able to participate in the knowledge economy. What we have seen is not just a lack of commitment to deal with humanitarian needs that are urgent, but also a profound lack of commitment to enable these countries to develop technological resilience and become more proficient. And I think that there's an arc of history here that is bending away from these countries becoming part of the knowledge economy. So I think that puts the whole of the TRIPS agreement in question. I think we have to ask these questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, so thank you. And so it's not just about giving us the leftover doses, it's also about decolonization and actually serving public health for everybody on the planet. And as I said before, we are at a turning point in the history of the century where we are faced by climate change and the pandemic, and we need governments to do the job, so to speak. So I would like to thank People's Health Movement. I would like to thank Health Action International. I would like to thank Public Citizen for putting such an immense effort into the work in the United States and supporting us. I would like to thank the Third World Network. And anybody who wants to know about MSF's work on COVID, please feel free to contact us. So thank you, Dr. Graham. Thank you, Siva. And thank you to all the organizers for joining us, and to the more than 300 people who stayed on to listen to the entirety of the discussions. So good evening to everybody and a good morning if you're in the United States or wherever you are. And we'll see you when we organize the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.